I'd like to introduce you today to John Meredith, the Assistant Chief Architect for Digital Health in Wales. Hello, John.
Hello, how are you?
Good to see you again, John. Very well. I haven't seen you for quite a while since COVID, but I trust you're well. Now, John, would you mind telling the audience a little bit about yourself, how you ended up where you are today, and what you're doing?
Well, it'll be a bit of a long story, but let me start at the beginning. The very beginning was absolute failure to be an engineering geophysicist. So I graduated from university, had a research degree, thought I'm going to be a geophysicist, and then couldn't last more than 12 months. And sort of pivoted into health, fell into health actually. It was always going to be technical. It was always going to be a digital kind of role. But the decision to move back to where I was born in South Wales, and settle down, get married, do all the grown-up things, had led me to join Cardiff and Vale, NHS Trust as it was in those days. From there, progressed to join mental health and community services team as a secondment. That's when I started doing some development work, low code, development tooling. And, a few roles after that, I sort of pogoed a little bit about until I sort of found my feet and spent a significant amount of time as essentially a data manager for theatres. I'd spent now, at that point, about 7 years in and around operating theatres and surgical support services, and was getting really into the data, using data for service improvement, service management, and things like that. Clinical service management now, not IT service management. And off of the back of that, there were two roles. One was about a data manager role for an organization that manages essentially, how do you describe it actually? Commissioning, the commissioning of new services and things like that. And the other then was in architecture as a lead application design architect, working for, as we were, NHS Wales Informatics Service, and as we became Digital Health and Care Wales. And there I've been now for the last 8 years. So about 3 years ago, I took a promotion managing the application design function. Essentially, a team of architects responsible for operational services across all of our sort of product structures and things like that. The team that I work with, really, we cover everything from name it, pathology, community, primary care, mental health, amongst a range, a plethora of different clinical domains. And it's really been fantastic, working with these guys, and also just the personalities. I'm really proud of my team. I enjoy being, the part of that team. But during that time, then I've also started to diversify. I ended up going into start researching, doing a PhD. I found out about openEHR, and really it's been now a core component of sort of my career for maybe the last 4 or 5 years, as I've sort of learned, explored, and realized actually that, there's a different way of working over the traditional, approach of black box siloed applications where you chuck all your data and they solve your problems and what have you. So teeth into open platforms, open data, open standards, and actually let's try and do things better. Let's try and do things in a different way.
Yeah, so it's a big responsibility, Wales. It's a big area. Tell me about openEHR and what's happening with openEHR, electronic healthcare record systems in Wales.
Yeah, so openEHR, I formally sort of, got my teeth into openEHR probably about 4 years ago. I thought that it was going to be a valuable tool for us. My first major project when I joined Edwards was to be the technical lead for the national diabetes solution for outpatient management. And very quickly, I realized we had a gap in our architecture. There was this notion at the time that you could make use of eForm technology, eForm capability, spin the form up really quick, give it to the clinicians, and they just do the data entry and their jobs are good. And the problem that we had with that project was, and it still happens today actually, is that a lot of projects are commissioned because of statutory reporting and data returns and things like that. And what I know now full well is that they are not the reason why you start to develop electronic health records. You know, the data structures that you have for, you know, for audit and secondary returns, for example, are all about normalized data. It might be aggregated. It might include, you know, it might include some, you know, it might not make sense actually. So one of the data items we looked at, we worked with the cardiac network in Wales, and in their statutory return, there's this, you know, I've got this on slides that I sometimes show to people. It says something like diabetes, no tablets, insulin, newly diagnosed. And that's like 3 or 4 actual individual data items, you know. So we are learning, and we have been learning, that we need to drive the data structures and the data standards, or put that at the beginning of the process. And that's you know, that's one of the things I care absolutely passionately about. But it's a real pivot, you know, because, you know, organizations, you know, such as the one I work for, you know, and this is no criticism. You can see this in the NHS. It's very organic, you know, needs justify why certain things happen and things like that. So it's not a criticism by any stretch of the imagination. But, you know, the problem isn't the technology. The problem is always going to be the human factors. It's always going to be how people interpret these requirements and things like that. But anyway, we had a gap. We didn't have a place to store structured data. We had silos, we had repositories and databases, but we also had the mantra, this kind of once for Wales kind of approach, and also that if it's once for Wales, we don't want to spin up any disease-specific repositories or databases. So the idea of spinning up a diabetes repository was, no, we can't do that. We'll use something central so that the data can be reused. So as a principle, that's spot on. That makes perfect sense. The unfortunate thing is the target repository was bonkers. Essentially, it was a blob of XML. It was part of document management, and really demonstrated actually what happened around about that time in terms of the pivot. You know, about 10 years ago, but even longer, you know, there's a big thing about document management and document scanning. You know, reduce the paper, scan the paper through, make it PDF available to clinical staff. Because, you know, then the perception of the goal was just put it in front of a clinician, they can read it, great. There was also sort of like I'd like to say that there's an element of housekeeping associated as well, you know, that actually we started, you know, you go into clinics and piled up with papers, you know, and that's clinical space, you know, that's valuable. So, you know, can we put that in a warehouse? Well, if we put it in a warehouse, how do we get it out of the warehouse? I know, let's digitize it. Great. It takes the average clinician, this is not a real fact, I'm just going to say this, but it takes an average clinician about 0.2 microseconds to look at a PDF before they start to want to do something with the data that's inside it. Now, you can't do that if it's a PDF or some other binary or even a blob of XML. It's a blob of XML. You've got to do something with it. You've got to shred it. So you've got to have a doohickey that sits there and goes, reads it and goes, right, let's slice it up and make sense of it. Now let's spit it out and make it able to be consumed by somebody else or something else. There's always something else. We needed to have a full series of services and repositories that allow structured data to be natively consumed by a variety of different consumers, systems, processes, and I think that's kind of the journey I've been on. It's just been really interesting to sort of have, you know, to be confronted by the perception that we've got all the solutions, know in my heart that we didn't have the solutions, and then work on how we actually develop, you know, develop an answer to those things. And really, that's the role that openEHR has played. As well as that, you know, I've learned so much about the role of interoperability. That's where I started doing my PhD research, is trying to slice up interoperability. You know, because 10 years ago, it was messages, system A, system B, a lot of stuff, you know, XML or, you know, most recently JSON. But that's just point-to-point technical interoperability. If system A knows what to send system B and system B does understand what's being sent, well, great. But that's a problem that's being solved. What we don't have a handle on is semantic interoperability, where the message can be natively understood and you don't literally have to almost hard code it. So there have been, you know, technologies such as HL7 Fire, which have started to gain maturity at the same time as openEHR, as well as wider to that, the notion that we're now understanding the role of SNOMED CT, for example. When I did an MSc when I was working at Cardiff and Vale, one of my papers was on the adoption of SNOMED CT, and that must have been about 13 years ago. And then I joined the national program, and it's like, right, we're rolling out SNOMED CT. I went, hang on a second, isn't this done? And it turned out it wasn't done, but for very good reasons, because it was the learning curve, and also the push from industry as well. The best, you'd argue that the best coded, repositories that would exist. Certainly, when I joined DHCW, was still primary care, and at that time, primary care repositories were populated with read codes, and the transition from reads to SNOMED is something that's taken quite some time. It's because there's complexities and all these interdependencies and things like that. And that just reinforces my belief about the requirement for an open platform approach and loosely coupled components. Try to develop, almost like a single source of truth kind of approach to certain data items. Although that's fraught with peril, because let's be honest, anybody can buy a black box. It's your single source of truth, right? Doesn't mean you can do anything with the data unless you can break out that ecosystem. But anyway, yeah. So technical evaluation of openEHR, took that to directors, took that to a variety of different assurance groups. We went through, quite a vigorous process. And, then we got confronted with, in fact, this happened during COVID. It's quite interesting because a lot of my colleagues got drafted to start firefighting and support the COVID initiatives. And I wasn't, and I had a bit more space then to actually finish off some of the work that I had just been, that had been taking too long, such as this was technical evaluation. So we commissioned a pilot with a company called Better Care, and did a whole bunch of testing and things like that. And then the response was, yes, this is a component that we need to adopt as part of our national infrastructure. It's not the solution, it's a piece of the puzzle. And also help us start to address as well this notion about what a low-code development environment looks like. And then during that time, I was working very closely with colleagues in the open space, colleagues such as Dr. Ian McNichol, who you've got to speak to. You've got to speak to Ian, and colleagues like Paul Miller from NHS Scotland, amongst loads of others. I'm really grateful to have such a wonderful network of people that I can learn from, and steal their ideas in case of Ian. I've stolen a bunch of his ideas, but then he's stolen a couple of things off me, symbiosis, I think we can call it. And yes, so I put myself forward for nomination for openEHR board, and I got in, and I was shocked as hell. But it's been really great. But it's that we're as an organization, we're a non-profit, the community interest company. And now I'm working with the CEO, Rachel Dunscombe. We need to help grow the brand, figure out what's next. And what's been really great is because my PhD research has been about looking at how openEHR fits into this wider ecosystem, with FHIR, with, traditional stalwarts like, IHE, the IHE SDS kind of like methodology is still really rigorous. It still works, yeah, it's just a really exciting time.
If I'm a provider, and I think I've got some solutions. How do I know what problems you have or what problems you want solved?
The problem's always data, right? You can come up with the best UI, the best product, clinical workflow, all of that kind of stuff. But unless it's so good that we're prepared to take a punt and just keep that data in your solution, which the answer is probably not nowadays, you've got to have an understanding about what that wider platform, that wider ecosystem looks like. When I started looking at this sort of stuff, technologies like FHIR and openEHR were gathering momentum. There was an element of competition. You can just blog, look at some of my old blogs, for example, openEHR versus FHIR. In fact, there was one point I was venting my spleen on almost like a weekly basis because I was having these conversations with people, and I said, It's not open air versus fire. It's open air and fire. What's wrong with you people? But 4 or 5 years ago, I've noticed that, I was having constructive conversations, so to say, especially on Twitter, with people. And I've noticed some of those people have come full circle. Because whereas for some reason I maybe just, I don't know why, maybe because I'm not too I'm technical, but I'm not, I can't develop photography. I'm not a programmer. I'd never represent myself, but I know enough to actually know what's required in order to do my job and to do my current role as assistant chief architect. So I don't know whether there's something like that, but I just immediately saw where these components kind of like sat together, and I've noticed, and I've spoken to people that I've previously had sort of disagreements with, who now come around to my way of thinking. Not completely, but we're all in the same ballpark. Whereas previously maybe may have been different chapters in the same book. Now we're a paragraph or two removed of the same chapter or something along those lines. And it's about digital maturity. It's about doing the work. It's about actually working through these problems and trying to find solutions. And invariably now, this idea of an open platform approach is something that's gathering momentum. And you've seen it in NHS England. There have been recent announcements in NHS England, like openEHR now as part of a foundational technology platform for the first time. Previously to that, it was Fire and SNOMED. But of course, those two communities, are solving certain problems, and they're important problems to solve. But there are a whole suite of other problems that are out there, such as, what's the foundation of a shared care record? My exposure recently, I've been blessed to work with another organisation, and they've just opened my eyes to what's happening in England, which is a lot of technological advancement and really, really good work, solid work that's helping bring about a next generation of patient care. But the underlying data still is sitting in silos, and it can't. We have to be able to open up those boxes and be able to get at that data. And my own hypothesis has always been we actually need a joined up, clinical information model that underpins this kind of stuff, and that's the data standard. That's the foundation by which we can go forward.
Would your system be used by another NHS operative in England or Scotland?
We've had systems in the past, I think, but we're going back a few years. We had a national child health system, for example, that was sold off into England. That was probably 3 organisations ago, though, if I'm being honest. I don't believe we really compete. My gut feeling, don't take this as this is the mantra or this is official policy or whatever it happens to be. My gut feeling really, or how I've approached these sorts of challenges when I've been sort of co-opted in or asked for my opinion, is realistically, if there's a market, if we've got a clinical problem or a digital tooling problem to solve, and there already is a market out there, is it worth us developing something ourselves? You put it through an options appraisal. Is it worth it? Yes, no. And if yes, you go to market and start working with suppliers and vendors. And if not, we've developed it ourselves. But there's no hard and fast rule there. We currently, for example, there's a national program for maternity system procurement. So there's that. Pathology, for example, pathology limbs. That's hard stuff. That's laboratory systems are really in the difficult territory. And why do people procure stuff? They procure stuff for solutions. They procure stuff also to be for risk management. They've got a problem. If they can put it in the hands of somebody else, even if it'll cost them more, that's presuming it's going to cost them more, which is a big assumption. But it allows organizations to maybe abstract out some of that risk, which is, fine from a strategic perspective. You don't have to develop everything yourself. And in some cases, there are very good reasons not to.
But openEHR, that's okay.
Yeah, sure. So openEHR is, as I said, not for profit. We're an organization that really is about driving a clinical data standard for healthcare around the world. You can look at it as open source and also crowdsourced. So there's a tool, for example, called Clinical Knowledge Manager. And if you go to ckm.openair.org, what you'll find there is essentially a data dictionary on steroids, right? You will find a whole bunch of these little, data components called archetypes. And essentially it's like Lego. It's digital Lego that you can use to develop more or less whatever you like. In my experience, virtually every single use case I've come up to, we're in the 80% territory. 80% of archetypes exist. They might not be perfect, but they exist. You could download them. You can then start to assemble them. The simplest way of sort of describing openEHR really is there's a separation of concerns. There's these clinical data items, these archetypes. And then the other side of the coin then is this rules engine, this reference information model, right, which is exceptionally powerful. And what that does is basically say, if you want to develop an archetype, say, for example, for blood pressure, everyone's favorite archetype, it's a specific type of an archetype. And because it's a specific type of an archetype, it has certain structures that are embedded within it. And those structures then allow a whole bunch of other things to happen, such as you can query for it, So, simple scenario, say, for example, you're working with a developer, they want to do a BMI calculator, right? So for that, you need to think about, right, okay, I've got to have a height, I've got to have weight, I've got to have the body mass index itself, and I'll assemble these together, and I'll put them together essentially into something that's called a template, but essentially it's an assembly of archetypes. What's clever about it is that as soon as you load that template into an openEHR repository, you immediately get an API that you can hit. And that API allows you to build a front end on top of. You can create, you can read, update, you can even delete, and a whole bunch of these standard APIs that allows you to basically fast track quite complex data structures into being, API led. The other thing about it as well is that, so, if I was to flash up an archetype right now, it branches in different directions. There's loads and loads of different stuff. A lot of it's optional. And the reason it's for optional is because the people that help build these employ, sort of a process called maximal, or it's called the maximal data model, or the maximal approach. I've been in rooms before with clinicians, right? And you say, right, what do you want? And then you get, a plethora of different sort of responses, and even people disagreeing with themselves, they'll change their mind 20 minutes later or whatever happens to be, And so historically, I thought, oh, you don't ask clinicians whatever they want. They'll have, there's a moon on a stick coming at you pretty damn soon. But what's interesting about it is that you do ask these people, these clinical informaticists, clinicians, data modelers, whoever they happen to be. There's sort of like a skill set that's associated with the people that do this kind of stuff. And you put it through this rigorous process. You reference where these things have come from. For example, is it best practice, are the clinical guidelines, whatever it happens to be. You put it through clinical reviews. You then pull a wider team of people in to do an editorial review. And then if there's a problem, you fix it, iterate, then finally publish if it's okay. And it's that kind of evidence-based practice that then creates a digital component, which is essentially software that then can be reused by anybody on the planet if they've got an openEHR repository. That's pretty compelling.
That's compelling. That's interesting. Okay, and that's something you're heavily involved in Wales.
Well, yes. So we've had to go through a series of different processes essentially, because we've now, a few years ago we morphed into Digital Health and Care Wales, essentially to give us more autonomy. We had to introduce a fully autonomous governance layer, because prior to that, the organisation was actually housed within an NHS trust. Which is common, especially when sort of national programs and what have you sort of like spin up. But it was cited that there needed to be autonomy and accountability at the executive layer of the organisation. So that was the big work that happened about 3 or so years ago. So most recently now, we sort of have been finding our feet as an organisation and going through the process of really just double checking, sanity checking. So even though we've been live with openEHR for a couple of years, we've been doing it in a very incremental kind of way. Now that's one of the benefits of it. You can do that. If you've got a specific problem, you can, it's small, well, that's what we started off doing. We started off doing just plugging a problem, which was, we were helping support replacement of the national cancer system. And we needed a place to store cancer treatment data, so radiotherapy and chemotherapy data. And short of spinning something up, and of course, I told you before, we're not allowed to spin stuff like that up. You know, it's not our considered best practice. We looked at that and started to develop those models ourselves and said, look, there's a role for open-air in this space, and we just did that. And then after that, then there was another gap that opened up to store some observations data. And then after that, there was the requirement for patient warnings. And each of these things individually, cancer treatment is fairly meaty in terms of what it's trying to accomplish. Like patient warnings was half a dozen fields. You know, it's the warning, date start, date end, comment field, maybe some other categorizations or whatever it happens to be. But that agility, the ability to actually set up shop at 9 a.m., develop some archetypes, test them, put them into the system, present an APIs for somebody to develop in, you know, there is a reasonably rapid turnaround because that's a simplistic, you know, viewpoint. You know, and that's not to say all the archetypes exist. But like I said before, 80%, something along those lines, you know, seems to be there. And that's not to say you don't have to make decisions. You know, it's not like, you know, the best shopping cart you've ever seen, or, you know, you're sitting in Sainsbury's or Tesco's, you know, and just go, oh, I have blood pressure and I'll take height and I'll take weight and I'll try to take child's Pew score, whatever that is. I know what it is, but, you know, there we are. And it's, you know, and take them off the shelf. You know, there's, you know, you know, you're hit with all sorts of different decisions that need to be made. You know, we're talking about modeling patterns that we have to employ. You know, is it an observation? Is it an evaluation? You know, it depends on what you're trying to achieve out of this. So there is sort of an art to it, and I don't claim to be a practitioner myself. Well, no, I am a practitioner. I don't claim to be, you know, somebody at the upper end of the food chain, but you know, I am proud of the archetypes I've built. That's for sure. But you know, it for me, it's what's interesting. I've always had a bit of a problem personally, right? I'll be honest, you know, even though I've got a research degree in sort of applied mathematics, which is my MPhil that I came out with. I didn't do a very good job doing my A levels. And I always had this thing at the back of my mind, which is like I always had to go to first principles. Now, you can't go to first principles in an A-level mathematics exam. You run out of time really, really quickly. So I didn't do a very good job there. But I've noticed this pattern that I've always had here. For me, open-air is about first principles. It's about those basic building blocks that you can actually build virtually anything you like with. That's probably why I found it so compelling. And not that I say it's an answer to absolutely everything. You know, if you just need to connect systems together, you're in the integration engine space. You know, you're in the pure interoperability space. You know, you don't persist data for the sake of it. You know, that would, you know, you keep data where it needs to be. For example, there are enough gaps in any clinical use case that I've looked at in my 19 years of you know, working within this domain where it can support. You know, and at the moment, I don't think there's anything else that's at that level, and I suppose that's because the gestation has been so long. You know, there's you know, originally it came out of UCL in London, got something like spun out of there. You know, has a rich history working. You know, being the output of certain, you know, European health projects and things like that. And it's something that over a period of time sort of gestated. And if you go to the specification, I would never do this to you, Stephen, but if you really are bored, go to specifications.openair.org and start reading. And there's volumes and volumes. It's technical specification in how to deliver this. And what's also great is we've got a great open source solution called Airbase, which has been you know, pioneered by you know, group of people that work for the Vita Group in Germany. And, you know, anyone can kind of spin it up now. And you can play around with it. But that's one of the things I've got to try and work on in the next 12 months is making that completely transparent. That's what Rachel Dunscombe said to me, John, sort it out. So I'm going to try to do that in my spare time. And we'll see where we get to.
All right. Well, John, it's been great talking to you. I'm going to let you get on with your day. You've been
No
always
problem.
very engaging and very informative. I want to talk to you again in 6 months' time about the progress you're making in Wales. But I wish you all the very best, and it's been good seeing you again.
It's been lovely seeing you. Look after yourself.